I'm actually one of the only U.S. agents to ever met one of the members called Tarek El-Assignee, who is an actual terrorist. He's wanted by the U.S. government. And I had a couple of meetings with him, as well as other meetings with some other members of the cartel. I probably met with 4 to 5 of those members of the Cartel de los Soles. And, that cartel is proliferated around the world with some heavy duty money laundering and shipping of narcotics, as I'm sure we'll get.
Well, yeah, let me start there. So, Cartel de los Soles is not a cartel that has been spoken a lot on this show. I've heard it in passing. We had a couple conversations with others, but what can you tell the audience about this cartel and how it's different from the Mexican cartel or similar?
Yeah, a lot of people don't really understand. And when they look at Venezuela, now we have a lot more highlighting of Venezuela with the Tren de Aragua, right? So,
Right.
Tren de Aragua, the gang, they're coming, they're chopping people's fingers off, they're kidnapping, they're killing, doing all these crazy things, right? And people kind of paid attention a little bit to Venezuela. Well, Venezuela is about 1,400 miles off the coast of Florida. Okay. Venezuela geopolitically has a very large presence when you look at it macro to micro. Let's go back and come out a little bit. We have Russia, we have China, we have Iran, we have proxies that train inside of Venezuela. We had Venezuela back in the day that was issuing their passport to a variety of people from nefarious action states in the Middle East, for example, right? And they would give background passports, like from infancy with birth certificates all the way through college in a stack and give it to them, and then they get a Venezuelan passport. Well, remember back 20 years ago, 25 years ago, the Venezuelan passport was valuable, right? Now it's not very valuable, but for many, many years it was. And once you get that Venezuelan passport back in, say, 2000, you can go pretty much anywhere you wanted to. So what happened was you started having this crime dynamic within the country, the corruption that kind of bled over with the Hugo Chavez, who then became the president of the country. And he had been in prison because he did a, coup d'etat, and he tried to take the country over, and he was thrown in prison. Fast forward 6 years, what do? They pardon him. He's out in jail, and then he runs for president. He wins. And this is where you start looking at
Right.
the Cartel de los Soles, because the Chavez regime wanted to take the United States and subvert it in many ways. One of the biggest ways was we're going to flood it with cocaine, we're going to flood it with narcotics, and we're going to, basically destroy the fabric of the United States of America in that aspect, right? Of course, they're going to send spies, they're going to do all this other stuff. But they are positioned in a region of the world in the Western Hemisphere where you have source country for cocaine. You have Colombia right next door. And what's in Colombia? The FARC, right? The armed forces, of Colombia. It's like a little, how can you put it in terms of what we would think in the United States? You have this group that says we're being undermined, kind of like an Antifa, but on steroids. And they want to take over because they feel they're being wronged in the country and they have to make money. So what do? So many of these criminal groups, they exploit the cocaine trade. And then you have, everything, from all the Colombian cocaine kingpins back in the day with, Javier Pena, Steve Murphy, Chris Feistel, Dave Mitchell, all those DEA agents investigating these big narcos. Come back now again, knowing that you have all these huge cocaine sources in that region. Chavez says to himself, hey, self, I can help them. I can harbor these fugitives of justice, because as they're committing crimes, the Colombian government saying, we're going to arrest them and send them to the United States, right? We've seen this in the movies, when you're looking at all the cartels, they were all facing extradition to the United States. They didn't want that, because in Colombia, they could have, a nice little tennis court, they could have their booze, cable TV, the whole thing, and enjoy life,
Nice
right?
prison.
That's the way it was. Well, so Venezuela, they just pay a little bit of money and they're going to live the good life, right? Under the radar there, and basically under the wing of the Chavez government. So then you start having all these military individuals in the structure of the government becoming involved, because everyone wants a little mordita a little bit of bite of the apple, right? Because they want to make money. And it evolved into this thing called the Cartel de los Soles, where our generals have, you have, stars, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, and then you have colonels and so forth. Well, the generals in Venezuela have little sons, soles, right? And that's where the Cartel de los Soles came into. But it kind of proliferated into government members. You have the president, you have the vice president, you have all the military commanders, and then you have figures that are way below captains, lieutenants, police officers, police chiefs. Everyone got involved in this. And as we fast forward through the 2 decades of Hugo Chavez, it turned into a behemoth. And they're sending tens of thousands of metric tons of cocaine to the United States through Venezuela. Ships, LPVs, aircraft, you name it, it's coming to the United States from Venezuela.
Yeah, that's crazy. I've never heard this side of the story because so much is focused on Mexico and just, in that space. I looked a little bit up on it and it was just interesting to see. And you explained it really well. How did, when you were out there in your work, how big of an impact was that making in some of your investigation or some of the work you were doing? I know you can't talk heavily about what was going on, but their imprint compared to what you see in the Mexican cartels, is it pretty heavily established within the government, kind of like the corruption side of the Mexican cartel? I'm very curious of how similar they work, or is it very different in how they kind of use their power?
So the mechanics of how things operate are the same anywhere you go, right? You're like, well, are you an SMA on this? Well, yeah, but you know what? Anyone could be. Once you get the model, it's the same model for all of these things, right? In a sense. But we put it in perspective of where they're located, and it's a transit country, okay? They're not producing the cocaine there. They're not doing the labs there per se. That's in the Colombian end. And because they're neighbors, the FARC will use all the coca production, heroin, obviously the amapola, and they make the heroin and so forth. They bring it down the rivers. They use the geography to bring it right to Venezuela. That's where the Venezuelan military will grab it, bring it into Venezuela. Now it's safe. Now you don't have to worry about anything because it's blessed. The Monsignor has said, go forth and multiply, guys. It's not a problem, okay? They bring it in. They arrange the aircraft. They arrange military shipping. You'll have military trucks or police trucks transiting all this dope to where it's got to go in these airstrips. And then you would have thousands of flights a year leaving, or maritime vessels that would take off, right? So the mechanics is pretty much the same for any kind of transit country. But when you're looking at, you have basically a country from the top down to the street level guys that are capitalizing on it. And it's kind of similar in a sense when you look at Mexico, right? But they're not our border, right? But
Right.
borders are not as stretched as they used to be anymore, because in 2025, it doesn't take much for me to send 4 tons of cocaine to Central America. It doesn't take really that much of a difference from 2015 to 2025 to send it to the Caribbean corridor. We have a compressed border because what's going on, but we've seen this before. Again, the cycles, the sets are all the same. You squeeze the southwest border, what happens? You kind of trend to move it to the Caribbean, right? You have some play in Canada, a very small amount when it comes to fentanyl. You're talking, I think they seized 49 kilos last year. You have less than 1% of all seizure of fentanyl that goes through Canada. But what you have in Canada, and it's important because we have, the border is not just southern border. We're dealing with it all, right? We're dealing north-south, and really, even though we don't have territory per se, we kind of do, but we have east and west because it's all maritime, right? But so Canada is, a first world country that can help us combat, right? Even though they are ill-placed to kind of fight it because they're kind of, I don't want to say weak, but I'm going to say weak, okay? Unfortunately, Canada, they have some great strong points to them, but when it comes to heavy-duty law enforcement, And what's driving a lot of crime is this expansion of the Mexican cartels into Canada and the motorcycle clubs and the alliances that are starting to take place up there, right? Okay. But in the scheme of things, Canada is very, very small. It's in an infancy stage of expansion. So now's the time to strike and cut that snake's head off beforehand. But as we move back to the southern border and we kind of piece this apart, and you look at Venezuela, and going back to the original question, now that we've kind of gone the macro micro on it, their job is to provide a safe haven for all this cocaine that's transiting, but not just cocaine. We're talking criminal elements. And that's what was happening when I was down there.